Every cycle begins long before we ever notice it, not with an action, but with a belief, a quiet belief, a comfortable belief, the kind of belief that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. It lives in the background, shaping decisions, reactions, and expectations without ever asking for permission. And most of the time, we don't question it. We inherit it. We learn what's normal by watching the people around us. We learn what success looks like, what failure feels like, what love sounds like, and what fear demands. And once something feels normal, it stops feeling optional. That's how cycles start. Not because they're true, but because they're familiar. At some point in life, many people begin to notice the pattern. The same frustrations showing up again and again. The same outcomes, different years, different faces, same story. And they'll say things like, "This always happens to me," or "That's just how things are." Those sentences sound harmless. They're not. They are beliefs in disguise. And beliefs repeated often enough become instructions. A cycle survives because it makes sense to us, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. Because the human brain is wired to protect what it knows, not what is best. So we rationalize, we explain, we justify. We convince ourselves that this is simply the cost of living the life we have. And slowly, without realizing it, we begin to defend the very thing that's holding us back. Here's the hard part to hear. No cycle exists without participation. That doesn't mean blame, it means involvement. Because every time we accept a belief without questioning it, we give it power. Every time we say, "I'm just not that kind of person," or "people like me don't get those opportunities," or "this is as good as it gets," we reinforce the loop, not intentionally, but consistently. Beliefs are powerful not because they're loud, but because they're repeated. Over time, they become identity. And once something becomes identity, challenging it feels like self-betrayal. That's why cycles are so hard to break. You're not just changing behavior, you're challenging who you think you are. Think about it. Most people don't resist change because change is hard. They resist change because change threatens a belief they've built their life around, a belief about their worth, their limits, their role in the world. And as long as that belief goes unexamined, the cycle remains intact. We often look for external causes. We blame the system, the timing, the circumstances, the people who came before us. And sometimes those things are real. They matter. They shape the starting line, but they don't decide the finish, because the moment we confuse explanation with permission, we stop moving forward. Breaking a cycle begins with a pause, a moment of honesty, a willingness to ask a dangerous question. Why do I believe this? Not who taught me, not where did it come from, but is it actually true? That question alone has the power to disrupt years of repetition, because many of the beliefs running our lives were never tested. They were absorbed, handed down, picked up along the way when we were too young, too tired, or too eager to belong to push back. And yet we continue to live by them as if they're facts. A belief only has power if we agree with it. An agreement is a choice, often an unconscious one, but a choice nonetheless. The moment we bring it into the light, it becomes optional, and optional beliefs are fragile. This is where discomfort enters the story. Because questioning a belief doesn't feel like clarity, it feels like instability. It feels like standing on ground that suddenly isn't solid anymore. And many people retreat at this point. They'd rather stay in a painful certainty than step into an uncertain possibility. But here's what's true. Clarity comes after courage, not before it. You don't wait to feel ready to challenge a belief. You challenge the belief to find out what you're capable of. Cycles don't demand strength to continue. They demand obedience. They ask you to keep doing what you've always done, thinking what you've always thought, and expecting what you've always expected. Breaking them, on the other hand, requires intention. It requires deciding that familiarity is no longer a good enough reason. When you change a belief, behavior follows, not instantly, not perfectly, but inevitably. Because actions are downstream from beliefs. You don't need more discipline, you need a better reason. You need a belief that serves where you're going, not where you've been. And this is the moment where responsibility becomes empowering. Because responsibility isn't about fault. It's about authorship. It's the decision to stop living life on default settings, to stop inheriting conclusions that were written by someone else's fear, limitations, or unfinished work. Breaking the cycle doesn't mean rejecting your past. It means refusing to be ruled by it. It means honoring what came before by choosing better with what comes next. The cycle begins with a belief, and the cycle ends the moment you decide that belief no longer gets to decide for you. Most people think change begins with action. Do something different, try harder, push more. But real change doesn't start with movement. It starts with awareness. And awareness is uncomfortable because it asks us to look at ourselves without the stories we tell to feel better. You can't break what you refuse to see. Patterns don't announce themselves. They hide in routines, in reactions, in the way you respond under pressure, in the excuses that come out automatically, in the moments where you say, I don't know why I do this. The truth is, you do know. You just haven't slowed down long enough to listen. Awareness begins the moment you stop numbing and start noticing. Noticing how you talk to yourself when things go wrong, noticing the tone you use when you're challenged, noticing what you avoid, what you delay, what you defend, because what you defend most fiercely is often where the cycle lives. We like to believe we're self-aware. Most of us aren't. We're self-familiar. We recognize our habits, but we don't question them. We know our flaws, but we wear them like fixed traits instead of unfinished work. We say things like, that's just how I am, as if awareness means acceptance, and acceptance means permanence. Awareness is not judgment, it's observation. It's the ability to look at your own behavior. The way you'd look at someone you care about deeply, with honesty, without cruelty, with curiosity, not excuses. The reason awareness is so rare is because it threatens the comfort of denial. Denial isn't lying to others. It's lying to yourself just enough to get through the day. It sounds reasonable. It sounds logical. And it keeps the cycle running quietly in the background. Awareness interrupts that loop. It's the moment you realize that the same argument keeps happening, just with different people. That the same opportunity keeps slipping away, even though the details change. That the same dissatisfaction follows you, no matter where you go. And instead of asking, why does this keep happening to me, you ask, what part of this am I participating in? That question changes everything, because now you're no longer a victim of the pattern. You're a participant in it. And participation means you have leverage. You can't control everything that happens to you, but you can control how long you pretend you don't see it. Awareness doesn't mean immediate change. In fact, most of the time, nothing changes at first. And that's where people get frustrated. They see the pattern, but they still repeat it. They catch themselves mid-reaction, mid-excuse, mid-avoidance, and they think they've failed. They haven't. They've progressed. Awareness creates a gap, a small one at first, a pause between impulse and action. And in that pause lives choice. Without awareness, there is no pause. There is only reaction. The same reaction over and over again. Cycles survive on speed, on autopilot, on unconscious repetition. Awareness slows everything down. It forces you to feel what you've been avoiding. And that's why it's so uncomfortable. When you become aware, you start noticing the cost of staying the same, the cost of avoiding the conversation, the cost of not setting the boundary, the cost of pretending you don't care when you do. And once you see the cost clearly, you can't unsee it. That's the point of no return. From that moment on, staying the same requires effort. Ignorance is no longer available. Every repeated behavior now comes with a quiet voice that says, you know better. And while that voice can feel annoying, it's actually the sound of growth. Awareness also reveals something else. Patterns don't come from nowhere. They come from protection. At some point, the behavior you're repeating kept you safe. It helped you survive. It helped you belong. It helped you avoid pain. And acknowledging that matters because it replaces shame with understanding. You don't break a cycle by hating the part of you that created it. You break it by thanking that part for its service and then choosing differently. This is where compassion meets accountability. You can understand why a pattern exists and still decide it no longer gets to lead. Awareness gives you that authority. Without it, you're stuck fighting symptoms instead of addressing the cause. Most people want a breakthrough without a breakdown. They want clarity without confusion. They want answers without asking the questions that might change everything. But awareness doesn't work that way. It dismantles before it rebuilds. And that dismantling feels like uncertainty, like standing between who you were and who you haven't become yet. It's tempting to rush through this stage, to replace one pattern with another, one belief with a slogan. But real awareness requires patience. It requires sitting in the discomfort long enough to learn from it. Because once you see the pattern, you start to notice the moments where you have a choice. Small moments, ordinary moments, a different response, a delayed reaction, a question instead of a defense. These moments don't look dramatic, but they're powerful. Awareness doesn't demand perfection. It demands presence. And presence changes everything. You stop living on autopilot. You stop reacting to life as if it's happening to you. You start engaging with it as something you're shaping, one decision at a time, one pause at a time. You can't break a cycle you don't see, but once you see it clearly, it never has the same power again. Most cycles don't survive because they're powerful. They survive because they're comfortable. Not easy. Comfortable. There's a difference. Easy requires no effort. Comfortable requires no courage, and human beings will choose comfort over growth far more often than they'll admit. Comfort is predictable. It tells you what tomorrow will look like. It tells you how people will respond. It tells you what pain to expect and how to manage it. And even when that pain limits you, at least it doesn't surprise you. That's why comfort is so dangerous. It disguises itself as safety. Discomfort, on the other hand, feels like risk. It feels like exposure. It feels like stepping into a space where outcomes are uncertain and identity feels unstable. And because the brain is designed to avoid threat, it labels discomfort as danger, even when that discomfort is the very thing that leads to growth. This is how cycles stay alive. They convince us that staying the same is safer than changing, that enduring the known pain is wiser than risking a new one. And over time, that belief hardens into a rule we live by. Most people don't stay stuck because they lack options. They stay stuck because their options make them uncomfortable. Setting a boundary feels rude. Speaking up feels risky. Starting over feels irresponsible. Trying again feels embarrassing. So we stay, we tolerate, we adapt, we shrink, and we call it being realistic. Comfort doesn't announce itself as fear. It shows up as logic, as responsibility, as patience. It tells you to wait a little longer, to give it one more chance, to not overreact. And sometimes that advice is wise. But when comfort becomes a lifestyle, it quietly turns into a prison. The cost of comfort is rarely immediate. That's why it's so convincing. It doesn't demand payment up front. It spreads the cost over time. A little dissatisfaction here, a little resentment there, a slow erosion of confidence, a quiet acceptance of less than what you're capable of. One day you wake up and realize years have passed and nothing has really changed. Not because you weren't busy, not because you didn't try, but because you never chose discomfort long enough to interrupt the pattern. Growth requires friction, always has. Muscles don't strengthen without resistance. Skills don't develop without struggle. Character doesn't form without challenge, yet when it comes to our lives, we expect progress without pressure. We want transformation without tension. It doesn't work that way. Discomfort is the signal that something new is happening, that you relieving familiar ground, that you're stepping into a space where old rules no longer apply. And that's exactly why it feels unsettling. You're not failing, you're evolving. But here's the part we don't talk about enough. Discomfort also threatens belonging. When you change, it forces others to confront their own comfort. And not everyone will celebrate that. Some will resist, some will criticize, some will try to pull you back to who you were, not because they want to hurt you, but because your growth makes their stagnation visible. So staying comfortable often feels like being loyal. Loyal to the group, loyal to expectations, loyal to a version of yourself that everyone recognizes. Breaking the cycle can feel like betrayal, even when it's the most honest thing you can do. That's why courage isn't loud. It's quiet. It shows up in private decisions no one applauds, in the choice to endure short-term discomfort for long-term integrity, in the willingness to be misunderstood before you're respected. Comfort asks, how do I avoid pain? Growth asks, what pain is worth it? Every meaningful change comes with a cost. The question is never whether you'll pay. It's when and for what. Avoiding discomfort today means paying with regret tomorrow. Choosing discomfort now means paying with fear, uncertainty, and effort. One payment compounds. The other expires. Cycles rely on the hope that things will change without you having to change first. That someone else will make the hard decision, that circumstances will shift, that clarity will arrive before courage is required. But clarity follows action, not the other way around. The moment you step into discomfort, something shifts. You discover you can survive it, that the fear you imagined is often worse than the reality you experience. And with each uncomfortable choice, your capacity expands. What once felt impossible becomes manageable. What once felt terrifying becomes familiar. This is how cycles break, not in dramatic moments, but in repeated decisions to choose growth over comfort, to say the hard thing, to do the unfamiliar thing, to walk away from what no longer fits, even when it still feels safe. Comfort keeps cycles alive by convincing you that now is not the right time. Growth reminds you that the right time is rarely comfortable. You don't break a cycle by waiting to feel ready. You break it by being willing to feel uncomfortable, because on the other side of discomfort isn't chaos, it's capacity. Most people overestimate how much change requires. They imagine transformation as something massive, dramatic, and overwhelming, a complete reinvention, a clean break, a bold, irreversible leap. And because that feels intimidating, they never start. But real change rarely begins with something loud. It begins with one quiet, brave decision. Every cycle looks unbreakable when you're standing inside it. That's because cycles are built to feel permanent. They stretch across years, sometimes generations, reinforced by habits, expectations, and unspoken rules. And when something has been around longer than you, it's easy to assume it will outlast you too. But that assumption is what keeps it alive. Cycles don't end when everyone agrees they should. They end when someone decides they've had enough. One decision is all it takes to introduce a crack. Not because the decision fixes everything, but because it changes the direction of the story. It's the moment where repetition stops being automatic and starts being optional. And that moment belongs to individuals, not groups. History doesn't move because of consensus. Families don't heal because everyone is ready. Cultures don't evolve because it's convenient. They change because one person goes first. That person is rarely the loudest in the room. They're often the one who's tired of pretending, tired of repeating explanations that no longer make sense, tired of living a life that looks acceptable on the outside but feels empty on the inside, and eventually tired becomes brave. Bravery is misunderstood. We think it means confidence, certainty, or fearlessness. It doesn't. Bravery is acting while the fear is still there. It's choosing integrity over approval. It's deciding that short-term discomfort is worth long-term alignment. When you make that first brave decision, you don't immediately feel empowered. You feel exposed, vulnerable, alone. Because when you step out of the cycle, there's no script, no familiar reactions, no guarantee of support. And that uncertainty can be paralyzing. But here's what happens next. The world adjusts. Not all at once, not perfectly, but slowly, quietly, in ways you don't notice until later. People respond differently. New opportunities appear. Old dynamics lose their grip. Not because the world suddenly changed, but because you did. One decision has ripple effects you can't predict. A boundary teaches others how to treat you. An honest conversation changes what's possible in a relationship. A refusal to continue a pattern forces everyone involved to confront it. This is why breaking cycles often creates resistance. When you change your behavior, you disrupt the system. And systems don't like disruption. They push back. They test you. They wait to see if this new version of you is temporary or real. That's where consistency matters. The first brave decision cracks the cycle. The next few reinforce the break. And over time, what once required courage becomes character. What once felt risky becomes normal. This is how generational change actually happens. Not through grand speeches or perfect plans, but through repeated, values-driven choices made by people willing to endure discomfort without immediate reward. You may never see the full impact of your decision, and that's okay. Because not all progress is meant to be witnessed by the person who starts it. Some change is planted like a seed, growing quietly long after you've moved on. The mistake many people make is waiting for validation before committing to change. They want assurance that it will work, that others will follow, that it will be worth it. But leadership doesn't want it for proof. It creates it. When you go first, you give others permission to question their own patterns. Even if they never say it out loud, even if they resist at first, your courage becomes a mirror, and mirrors are uncomfortable. but they're also powerful. One brave decision can rewrite the expectations others have of you, and more importantly, the expectations you have of yourself. It resets what you're willing to tolerate. It raises the standard of what feels acceptable, and standards shape outcomes. This is where meaning enters the conversation. Breaking a cycle isn't just about personal improvement, it's about contribution. It's about deciding that your life will be evidence that change is possible, that patterns can be interrupted, that the future doesn't have to look like the past. You don't need permission to do that. You don't need agreement. You don't need to have all the answers. You need one decision that aligns with who you're becoming, not who you've been. Because cycles don't end when circumstances change. They end when someone is brave enough to change first. Most people think meaning comes from achievement, from hitting targets, reaching milestones, collecting rewards that prove they were successful. And for a while that works. The applause feels good, the recognition feels earned. But eventually the feeling fades. And when it does, a question quietly appears, is this all there is? Meaning doesn't come from what you get, it comes from what continues after you. Breaking a cycle is one of the few acts in life whose impact stretches beyond your own experience. When you interrupt a pattern, you're not just improving your circumstances, you're changing the environment that shapes everyone who comes after you. And that's where meaning lives, not in the moment, but in the legacy. Cycles don't just affect individuals, they shape cultures, families, teams, and organizations. They define what's acceptable, what's rewarded, and what's ignored. When a cycle remains unbroken, it teaches the next generation what to expect and what to settle for. And when someone finally interrupts it, they introduce a new possibility. That possibility matters more than you may ever realize. You might never meet the person who benefits most from your courage. You might never see the doors that open because you refuse to accept the old rules. But the absence of your action would have been felt just as deeply. Meaning often hides in consequences we never witness. This is why breaking a cycle feels different from chasing success. Success is immediate. Meaning is patient. Success asks, what did I achieve? Meaning asks, what did I change? When you break a cycle, you're saying something important without using words. You're saying that fear doesn't get the final say, that convenience isn't the highest value, that repeating the past is not the same as honoring it. These messages ripple outward, shaping behavior in ways you can't control and shouldn't try to. People are always watching, not in the way that creates pressure, but in the way that creates permission. They notice what you tolerate. They notice what you challenge. They notice what you walk away from. And whether you intend it or not, those choices become reference points. Meaning is built when your life becomes a reference point for something better. This is especially true when the cycle you break was never discussed openly. The unspoken patterns, the normalized dysfunction, the habits everyone jokes about, but no one addresses. When you interrupt those, you don't just create change, you create language. You make it possible for others to name what they've felt but never articulated. That's powerful. It takes courage to accept that your role in life may be to be the bridge, not the destination, to be the one who absorbs the discomfort so others don't have to do the hard work of change, knowing the greatest benefits may belong to people you'll never meet, but that's what makes it meaningful. Meaning doesn't demand perfection, it demands intention. It asks you to live in a way that's aligned with values that outlast circumstances. When you break a cycle, you're choosing values over convenience. You're choosing responsibility over resentment. You're choosing contribution over comfort. And those choices shape identity. You stop asking, what do I want right now? You start asking, what kind of future am I helping to create? This shift changes how you make decisions. Short-term wins lose their appeal when they undermine long-term integrity. Temporary relief feels hollow when it reinforces a pattern you've worked hard to dismantle. Meaning acts as a compass, not a reward. It doesn't make decisions easier, but it makes them clearer. Breaking a cycle also reframes sacrifice. What once felt like loss begins to feel like investment. The time, energy, and discomfort you endure stop feeling wasted when you realize they're building something bigger than you, something durable, something that doesn't disappear when motivation fades. That's the difference between change and transformation. Change adjusts behavior. Transformation reshapes what you believe is possible. When you live in a way that reflects transformation, others feel it, not as pressure, but as possibility. They see proof that the old story isn't the only one available, and that proof matters more than advice ever could. You don't need to preach. You don't need to convince. You just need to live it consistently, because consistency turns intention into culture. And culture is what survives you. Breaking the cycle is not the end of the journey. It's the beginning of something that continues long after you're gone. Long after your name fades from memory. Long after the details are forgotten. What remains is the standard you set, the expectation you changed, the future you made easier for someone else. That is meaning. Not what you built for yourself, but what became possible because you were willing to go first. Breaking the cycle is not a moment. It's a commitment, a quiet daily decision to live with intention instead of tense, with courage instead of convenience. By the time you reach the end of this journey, one truth becomes clear: cycles don't define you. Your choices do. You were never meant to simply repeat what came before you. You were meant to examine it, learn from it, and decide what deserves to continue and what ends with you. That responsibility isn't a burden, it's a privilege, because not everyone becomes aware enough, brave enough, or willing enough to choose differently. The cycle begins with belief. It weakens with awareness. It survives through comfort. It cracks with courage, and it finally ends when meaning becomes bigger than fear. That's the path. Not straight, not easy, but deeply human. You may not always feel strong while breaking the cycle. There will be moments of doubt, loneliness, and resistance, both from others and from within yourself. That doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. It means you're doing something rare. Growth often feels like loss before it feels like freedom. What matters is not perfection, but persistence. Not dramatic change, but consistent alignment. Each time you pause instead of reacting, choose discomfort over familiarity, or act in service of something larger than yourself, you weaken the grip of the past and strengthen the future. And here's the most important part. You don't break the cycle just for yourself. You do it for the people who will never have to heal from what you chose to end. You do it for the standards that will feel normal because you raised them. You do it for the future that will look different simply because you are willing to go first. Legacy is not built in grand gestures. It's built in small, brave deces. Ions repeated over time. Decisions no one applauds. Decisions that feel invisible in the moment. But those decisions compound. They shape environments. They redefine what's acceptable. They quietly change lives. One day, someone will benefit from your courage without ever knowing your name. They'll walk into a healthier space, a safer relationship, a stronger culture, and they'll assume that's how it's always been. That assumption is the proof that the cycle was truly broken. So if you ever wonder whether it's worth it, remember this. The work you're doing now is creating a future where strength doesn't come from survival, but from choice, where growth doesn't require pain because someone before them did the hard work. The cycle ends when you decide it does. And what begins after that is bigger than you.